And for us, we want to make sure that they're having the opportunities to not just work on new things and learn about the technology, but work with new people. And putting new people together oftentimes results in a lot of learning, right? Because you're seeing new ways to do things from each other.
Yeah.
So in that way, we've adopted, and we didn't invent this by any means, but we use a squad model. And so a squad model is essentially a time sensitive feature team. And so our company has a number of these teams.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the If Then podcast. This is your host, Dave Murray, and today we are joined by Matt Cantor, who's the head of integrations at Growth Loop. So, Matt, it's very awesome to have you with us today. Welcome to the show.
I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Matt, before we get started, we normally have this one tradition, and which I think is very fitting for you because I know we talked a little bit about your background. Um, so, Matt, from the recent past, what's been your most favorite or memorable meal?
So, I've had a lot of memorable meals in my life, and certainly in the last 20 years, can't count the number of times I've walked out of a restaurant and just been blown away. I've been fortunate to be able to travel a bit, and if we were to cluster my meals, I'd say that the biggest cluster is probably in the north of Spain, where this is sort of eating as sort of a hobby and in some ways maybe a competitive sport. And so I've been there many times, and I always like going there. And so it's a really tough call. There's certainly no shortage of great food in North America as well. So in prepping for this, I sort of had to go through like every year that I went out to eat and think through like what were those meals that were really memorable, and there were plenty in like Philadelphia and in the Pacific Northwest and in New York, of course. And Chicago is always also like a really great place to find pretty awesome food. Um, so all of those meals have been very different and all very extraordinary. But in terms of succumbing to recency bias, in January, I was in Chicago for a get together with my company, Growth Loop. And it was probably one of the coldest days that I've ever experienced as an adult. It was, I don't know, minus a billion or something. And it was just terrible. But I like Chicago, and Chicago's culinary scene has really been just growing and growing and growing for the last 20 years. A guy who I knew who I went to culinary school with back in the early 2000s, he had worked at some of the top restaurants in Chicago, like Alinea. He ran Blackbird. He worked at a couple other places, and he was a really great and passionate cook, and his wife is a really great and passionate pastry chef. And they opened their own Danish restaurant called Elski. And I went there with some work colleagues in mid-January, and they were pretty adventurous. And this was really like one of the more different meals that I've had, but
Yeah.
also definitely one of the best. That he really put together a great team and built a restaurant where every single dish, and I think we had about 16, 17 things and a bunch of cocktails, were different and just awesome. And the cocktails too, right? Really, really stuff that was just mind blowing that they were putting into those cocktails, but they were so well balanced and drinkable, and just perfect. So it was, I'd say Elski's really like in the last bit, like definitely like one of the best restaurants that I've eaten at.
That's so amazing. I actually had the opportunity to eat at Alenia late last year. It was uh, the chef's name is Grant Takat, so I've been following him for a while. So yeah, um, this is awesome. So Matt, you obviously mentioned you went to culinary school. Um, Maybe I think our audience would really love to essentially get to know you a little better. So, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah. Hi, audience. I'm Matt. I've been living in Toronto for the last 15 years or so. I'm originally from the U.S. I've lived all over the U.S. I've lived in New York and Philly and D.C. and Portland and some other places. But more recently, I've got three kids under 8 years old. My wife is a real dynamo. She's an entrepreneur and really sort of the amazing one between the two of us. And that's sort of what my sort of non-work day looks like. Since we're here to talk about tech startups, I can talk about my time as a software person going back to when I was about 10. I wrote my first piece of software on an Apple II. And for those of you who are curious, I'm happy to share the details of what circuit boards were in that Apple II, because I still remember to this day buying them and plugging them in. And I think I burned one of them. These days, in the last N years, I've worked at a lot of big companies like IBM and Booz Allen Hamilton and Lotus, if y'all know what Lotus was. But for the last 15 years, it's been mostly startups. These days, I work at a company called Growth Loop, which is in the marketing technology space. We are a CDP, a customer data platform, and I wear a number of hats there. I started there as a contractor, as I do in some of my roles, and eventually just wind up taking up as much space as I can and getting my fingers into every little project that they'll let me. And so I've mostly been doing mentoring and architecture work more recently. Yeah, I think that's it in the short term. My focus currently is really on helping engineers in the software world level up and think about their careers and that sort of thing. So I'm trying to get a book out, but we'll see how long that takes.
That's amazing. So, Matt, to dive in a little bit deeper, like maybe over the last couple of months, what are the set of things that you have been working on?
That's a good question. So Growth Loop is a very fast moving and fast growing organization. And so there's a number of things going on. We put out some pretty big features in the last 6 months or so that have really been game changing for us. I mean, our platform before the whole large language model AI movement sort of kicked in was already really valuable and just accomplished a lot for our customers. But layering on some of that technology has really allowed us to make it easier to use, and it's allowed us to sort of bridge some gaps where in the past things were, our customers had to think a little bit more and type a little bit more, so we create audience segments from customer data in data warehouses. And so now we've come up with a way for a large language model to do that for us. And not only that, but by looking at a database, it can figure out what the options are, right? Like it can suggest to you, hey, why don't you create this kind of segment because it looks like it would be really beneficial to your company. And so that's really been a game changer for us, and a lot of our customers are really excited about that. And the other one is journeys, right? And so Salesforce and some of those bigger platforms have journey orchestration. And so we've added journey orchestration, and we've added large language model support to our journeys as well. So you can now do workflows within our tool. And that's both of those things I think we're first to market with, and we're feeling, they're really
Yeah.
great pieces of technology for us.
No, this is super cool. So, like, obviously in your work you're having to think about a lot of like ingestion from different sorts of data sources, how to
That's right.
operate on them in reasonable time frames, and then get models, etc., some sort of execution processes to go against that data. So like how, like, taking from these underlying challenges, I'm very curious to learn how you have structured the team today.
Yeah, that's a great question. So team structure for us, a number of things go into like how we think about team structure. We're a very small company. Our engineering team is only 20 people, and they're humans, right? So uh, they have these sort of human characteristics of curiosity, and they also burn out, and they like to learn, and they like to learn new things, and they like challenges. And for us, we want to make sure that they're having the opportunities to not just work on new things and learn about the technology, but work with new people. And putting new people together oftentimes results in a lot of learning, right? Because you're seeing new ways to do things from each other.
Yeah.
So in that way, we've adopted, and we didn't invent this by any means, but we use a squad model. And so a squad model is essentially a time sensitive feature team. And so our company has a number of these teams. So if you think about, we're going to build, let's say, the journeys feature as an
Yeah.
example. So for a quarter, we're going to have, let's say, 5 people on that squad. And there's going to be a leader, and there's going to be people from different aspects of the technology stack that are involved in the journey system, to work on that and develop it and ship it and support it. And so you've got a lead who's somebody who's a bit more senior, and you have, let's say, you have a person who works on our front end stack, which is TypeScript.
Mhm.
You have somebody who works on the Ruby side, and then you have somebody who's a Python, more focused Python engineer, and so those people will work on this feature. And most people are only on one, sometimes two of these squads, but you have a primary squad. And so you'll work on that for a quarter, and then we give people the opportunity to switch squads if they want to. And then we sort of, as management, try and shake out who's where, and do we have does everybody want to be on the machine learning squad, right? Which happens, and you have to sort of figure out, okay, who's going to be on it now, who's going to be on it later, and sort of prioritize how that works. But this has given us,
Yeah.
I think, a lot of benefit, and
Yeah.
also from a management perspective, if cross training is also good to make sure that no matter what happens, that there's somebody in the company that knows how things work.
Yeah. So Matt, like for the logical like grouping or categorization of these squads, are those primarily around like business areas, or is it more split out on how certain products are architected, like maybe something based on the infrastructure or different? Because you already mentioned how you have people with different language expertise in each of the squads ultimately.
Yeah, so I mean, we're a bit of a matrix that way, right? We have the squads, and the squads are really just comprised of the people working on the business logic or the feature. But we
Yeah.
also, logically, like many software teams, we think about groups from the technology side. So, we have a Ruby team, we have a platform team, we have a TypeScript team,
Yeah.
and they don't necessarily work together, but they do sort of mentor and support each other. They do code reviews together. They
Cool.
do meet regularly to talk about like what's everybody working on, what are some of the issues with our platform that we need to think
Yeah.
about, what's new with, like, what kind of fixes are coming from the Ruby side that we need to implement, right, from Rails, or like Python 3.12,
Yeah.
what kind of issues are there. So those constructs exist as well, and so we have technical leadership there, and that's a little bit. Those are obviously more permanent, right? Because uh, you have a Ruby team that is going to be a Ruby team for forever, um, and so it's different than a squad model, right? Because
Yeah.
you for the most part, when you are at Growth Loop, you have a primary focus. Now that said, I showed up at Growth Loop as a contractor to do Ruby work, and I think for the last 2.5 years, I really haven't touched Ruby at all. It's been more Python and Golang and other stuff like that, and design work. So we don't necessarily put up restrictions. People can work wherever they feel comfortable working, and a good number of our engineers really do float around and just try and unblock themselves and contribute to other parts of the
Yeah.
platform when they have the opportunity.
So this makes sense, right? But now, couple of questions floating on in my mind are around the theme of, okay, so you have teams based on whatever expertise exists, and which is um, it's a longer lasting categorization that will exist for the lifetime of the company, or till that changes. And then you have this concept of squads, which is an overlay on top of that. So
Right.
from the management perspective, how do you think about measuring? Like, are we going the right direction? So yeah, I'd just love to learn a little bit about how you all are tracking different metrics or even like measuring things within the organization.
So one of the challenges with working with a small startup like ours is that we don't have the economies of scale that bigger companies do.
Yeah.
So we have to be really, really careful about how we spend our time. Um, and as much as we want to measure everything, and I want to measure everything, um, you know, we just can't, because there's work to do to get features out for customers. So we have to give a lot of thought to, how do we effectively understand what's going on our teams and our product, uh, without dedicating a lot of resources to doing it. That said, we do have metrics and we do try and understand what's going on from a software engineering perspective, and we do measure some things. So we look at sprints fairly regularly, and we do a lot inside of Monday.com, which is what we use to do sprint planning. And we've developed a whole dashboard there that really paints a great picture of a good number of aspects of how the teams are doing. Um, and so I think that's been very beneficial. I'd say that metrics from things like Jira and Monday can be a little bit challenging because they're, if you're tracking story points, those aren't really hard numbers, right? They're soft numbers.
Yeah.
But in our case, they're the numbers that we have. So we do our best to work with those. And the other area where we get some stuff out of the box is GitLab, which is where we store our code, and it runs our CI pipeline, and that gives us a lot of information on like how long has an MR been open, how long does it take
Yeah.
to build a pipeline and run a pipeline, and so that informs us a little bit too. And you think about those sorts of numbers are really good at understanding in some cases, like what's slowing us down, you know and looking at like teams of MRs, is anything really being bottlenecked there?
Yeah.
um but taking a step back from all that, with 20 people and
Yeah.
a very active management team, we kind of know what's going on because we're neck deep in it. So we know how many times somebody's had to rebase their code in order to get it to ship, and sometimes when we don't run microsystems, like we don't have 100 little systems to manage. We've got a handful, and so there's often merge collisions and rebasing to do, which definitely slows us down. And so we see that, right? And we see a lot of these things that in bigger organizations you'd really have to put metrics behind or use a tool like Linear B to sort of understand. And so for us, it's a little more obvious, and so
Yeah,
we
yeah,
choose to not measure quite as many things and really just sort of use our eyeballs and our ears.
which makes a lot of sense. It's great that you all already have some of these insights, right? Because rebasing, etc. As engineers, we know, like it's ultimately some level of context switching that ends up happening, right? As I'm trying to merge something. So this makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense. Okay.
yeah, and like you think about context switching, that's hard to
Yeah.
measure, right? Like how
Yeah.
often somebody's getting distracted on Slack is hard to measure,
Yeah.
but it's stuff that we see and we already know like these have been problems for years at companies, so
Yeah.
we try and put things into place to make sure that
Yeah.
we minimize them where we are.
And so normally then, Matt, like whenever the management team is seeing too many of a certain class of issues occur, I'm assuming that just leads into the prioritization decisions internally on, okay, we really need to fix this now. This is getting insane.
Yeah, yeah, and for us it's really like we look at things like the 80-20 rule or the 90-10 rule, whatever you go by, which is like what how can we sort of resolve this fairly well without putting a whole lot of work into it. And so we
Yeah.
tend to brainstorm those things, like quite frankly, in many companies, Slack, as powerful as it is also very much a distraction, and so rather than us try and figure out how to how to reorganize our company, or what some people do, we really just told everybody like, put when you're working, mark yourself away, and if we DM you, then it's important, but otherwise, like, go about your business. And like that, those two sentences really saved us a lot of time.
I think this is a great segue into another topic I want to dive into. How do you like, from what I see in many of our, in many engineering teams that are very distributed, staying in sync ultimately gets pretty hard. And like we'll end up depending on tools like Slack or in your case Monday.com, etc., to keep collaborating on like things with, in our case, our teammates, we might be working on a similar thing, which is the concept of a squad, ultimately, is what you're calling at Growth Loop. Like, you have people from different geographic locations or even different continents, oftentimes. So, how do you like, how is the Growth Loop team today? How do you think about like everyone being in a similar time zone, and generally how that impacts engineering collaboration?
Yeah, well, it certainly does. I've worked on distributed remote teams for a long time. I was on a distributed team when I worked at IBM in the late
Yeah.
'90s. I carried around a token ring adapter and used to plug it in so that I could get internet wherever I was, and that was the way the teams were then. We've come a long way, but some of the principles are still the same. So with Growth Loop, one of the things that we try and do is really keep everybody within the sort of the four-ish North American time zones,
I see.
uh, right? And so we tend to avoid, in most cases, hiring in Europe or in Asia or in the Middle East, uh, just because there's plenty of talent here in North America. Now that said, um, because of the time zone situation, it also opens up to us South America and Central America. So
Yeah.
our team is on this side of the planet, but they're also on the bottom and the top. So while we have a lot of people in the United States and Canada,
Yeah.
we've got about a dozen people in Canada. We have people in Colombia and Uruguay as well.
Oh, cool.
And so they're essentially on similar time zones to us, and we work very well with them in that way. And having people overseas, it can be challenging for sure. In most cases, when you have like a few remote people, they often wind up losing touch with the team, and they wind up getting assigned sort of like
Yeah.
individual contributor type tasks. And it's neither good nor bad. That's sort of how it is, and we do have a couple people like that, and they traditionally have tended to sort of be a little bit more on the support side.
I see.
Yeah, but not only that said, in some cases, people they sleep during the day and they work at night if they're in India, so they can
Yeah,
work with the team. But that in of itself can also create a lot of burnout
of
and issues
course.
for them, especially if they have a family. So
Yeah,
so it's not something that we entertain really,
yeah.
but it has happened from time to time.
So in a when operating in an environment like this, we actually operate in something very similar. Um, Now you have people in different geographic locations coming online and doing their work at whatever times. Having a consistent work experience for everyone, like in our land, this becomes a developer experience. We find to be like at that point in time, every developer isn't questioning everything up and down the stack, and they can just focus on whatever area that they're working on. How do you think about developer experience fundamentally? And maybe is there a difference between DX at a smaller size company versus as the company is maturing?
I think there's a few things. One is, Growth Loop is an interesting place because our engineers are all fairly senior. So we don't necessarily, in some cases, need to be explicit on how our engineers work. For instance, I use JetBrains tools when I write code, but most other people don't. They use a variety of tools like VS Code. A couple of people use VI, and in those sorts of cases, it's really comes down to how productive you are on
Yeah,
your machine. I mean, when you get into sort of some of the automation, like linting and testing and CI, then we really start to think about things that larger companies talk about as well.
yeah,
And so for us, we constantly try and evolve those tools. We try and introduce ways to build things faster and cleaner and more accurately. We introduced linting, you know, years ago, and we
yeah,
continue to say like, is this the best way to do this? And the same with testing, and the same with continuous integration, continuous delivery. Right? We're not only trying to make the tools better, we're trying to make them faster. Right?
yeah,
We think about, I got this M2 Mac, and like I went from an Intel kind of nice nice MacBook Pro to this M2 MacBook Pro, and wow, like things took way less time.
yeah.
I wasn't waiting 3 minutes to build something. I was waiting like 30 seconds and or less, and it was really fantastic. So we do think about that, and we try and make sure people have a reasonably good equipment. The other thing that we've done from a developer perspective is we built some of our own tools. Like we have this CLI, which has a gazillion commands that make everything
Yeah.
that we do on a daily basis really easy and transparent. So it takes the place of like the AWS CLI and the kubectl and Postman and a number of other tools that we used to use. We now can do 80% of our work with the CLI without really having to do a lot of setup and
Yeah.
configuration. And I think that for us, that's been a game changer because we can do everything from one place, and we can see, we can do everything from spin up pods to look at metrics and rerun jobs. So
That's amazing.
that's been a real godsend for us, and that's something like we have a hackathon going on this week, and one of the projects is like, hey, what else can we put in the CLI?
Yeah.
So it's things like
That's
that have really
fantastic.
been great for us as a small company.
Yeah, because all of this consolidation, right? Because it ultimately lets you offer a unified experience ultimately. And
Yeah,
this
that's
is
right.
super cool.
And not only that, right? Like we have solutions architects that work with our customers, and so they have access to these tools as well.
Makes sense.
So, if a customer asks them a question, we always pride ourselves on how quickly you can navigate our
Mhm.
UI to figure things out. But there's not everything is surfaced in our UI. So we have this other tool that will give them these other details, and it's sort of right at their fingertips.
Amazing escape hatch. Nice. So Matt, now to zoom out a little bit again. How do you all think about prioritization, especially at the management-ish layers or at the leadership layer?
Good question. You know, demonstrating ROI in a company our size doesn't happen very often. It's really more of an instinctual thing, and
Yeah.
because we're so small, I think a lot of us are sort of on the same page because our values are aligned, and we think about things in a similar way, and all have like sort of we're all very pragmatic. Um, my father never had an answering machine, and he never wanted one in the house. He always said that if something was really, really important, the people would call back. And this is sort of a principle of being, a product manager is not saying yes to everything. It's like how often can you say no until something continues to surface enough to where you really think it's worth considering. And that's sort of one of the rules we have. The other thing for us is that we try not to throw money at the problem. When something's not quite right with one of our systems, we tend to do a lot of root cause analysis, and so that's asking a lot of questions like why did this happen, why did that happen, and really trying to dig down to that, like that source of the problem and then fix it. And that's really important for us because it's really easy to just spin up more resources or hey, let's just shove some data in Redis and that will solve it. But that doesn't really help us understand what's going on. And over time you wind up with just a lot of resources and a lot of problems. So for us, I think it's really important to not necessarily say, hey, we need this, we need that. Let's see if there's a way to not need this first before we actually go out and get it.
Yeah, it's always give me a bigger GPU or a bigger VM, like more
Yeah.
compute, more everything.
Yeah. I mean, like 4 years ago, I was at a startup and things, I came in and they had this product and it was not working very well. And,
Yeah,
and we, the team sat down and we're like, hey, well, we have so much data here. Let's just use Kafka because it seems like the right tool for the right job. And at the time it was. When I came into Growth Loop, one of the CEO kind of mentioned early on, he said, I know you guys are going to rebuild this system, but whatever you do, please don't bring Kafka in here. And Kafka is very powerful, but it's expensive to run, and it
yeah,
is can require some resources. And so instead of doing that, we really brought in something that was much more lightweight, and we've had to custom tailor it and rewrite a bunch of things. But at the same time, it's easily manageable, and we've learned a lot about our systems that way without just throwing
yeah.
money at the problem.
Oh, this is great. Matt, we are getting close to time, but I do want to get your thoughts on one other question that's been going on in my mind. When we are
Sure.
hiring, the hiring and interviewing process, especially in a very distributed team like the one you have, how do you how do you interview new candidates? How do you know if this is a good fit or mutually?
Well, so uh, I've had the benefit of being one of the lead interviewers at Growth Loop for the last 2+ years. And so I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of candidates for many, many roles across the engineering organization. Um, I will say, like, there's only so much you can really tell in interviews. We don't do coding challenges. Uh, we don't feel that they're necessarily useful, and they take up a lot of time, and they really sort of drive away some people who might otherwise be a good fit for
Yeah.
various reasons. But we do we tend to ask some really basic questions and then sort of go really really deep. And by going deep and asking a lot of questions and really trying to get down to sort of some fundamentals, you really
Yeah.
start to understand how a person behaves and how they think. And so we talked to them about a problem that they solved or something they built. We asked them to design a system for us. We asked them to do a code review, and then they meet, a number of different people across the organization, and 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 at the end of the day, we make a decision, and everybody has to be unanimous
Yeah.
in order to move forward. And I don't know that's too different than other places. I will say that at least at the size we're at, we don't hire people who aren't really senior, because we do want to make sure that they can hit the ground running. And what we don't have time for at our size is doing months and months of onboarding with people.
Yeah.
Right. And so for us, it's really important that you're able to jump in and get things done and teach yourself things. So
That's
for us, also our product team is really small, right? Can you make changes to a system without like a whole bunch of paperwork and specifications and drawings? Can you work with more than 3 MRs open at a time, right? Can you do a little bit of context switching? Because it takes a while for things to get reviewed, in some cases. And then, do you ask for help and do you help others? This is something that we
yeah.
expect, right? We don't expect you to grind on a problem for 3 days. If you can't figure it out in an hour, like, ask somebody else who may have already solved this problem.
No, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, Matt, I think we should probably wrap it up here so we can also let you go. But thank you. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.